Hi all, thanks for dialing into today's webinar, Gaining BI Sponsorship. Just a couple of things before we get started. We just launched one of our poll questions, and we use these just so I sort of understand where the audience is at in this. For this context, it's where you're at in your BI sponsorship. Also wanted to make sure that you can hear me okay, so if you have any issues with hearing me, please go ahead and drop a little note in the message window there and send that off to us so we know that there is an issue. Otherwise, we don't really know that there's an issue. And also, throughout today's webinar, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to go ahead and drop those also into the question panel there, the question pane. If you have a pane that is a question, drop it in the question pane. All right. I also have with me today Cindy Ilwine, and she's going to be helping moderate the webinar. So we're looking here at the responses for the poll, and it looks like about 43% of you have sponsorship, 57% of you do not. So we're split evenly, and I'm assuming that even though there's folks out there that have sponsorship, there's something that's challenging you associated with that sponsorship. So hopefully the discussion today, the content today will help you along those lines. We're going to go ahead and get started here. So our agenda today is really going to focus on 3 case studies. But along the lines here, when we talk about these case studies, some critical things we will address is why executive support is critical, how to have some of those key discussions that you have to have with these folks, and methods of creating supporting infrastructure and processes. So in this context, I'm not talking about infrastructure in the data warehousing environment or your network or anything like that. What I'm really talking about is your people network throughout your organization, and how do you create the infrastructure that will support your BI program as you move forward, as you go down your BI journey. So as we begin here, it helps to put this into a little bit of context. And, whoa, sorry about that. I must have some, hope I don't have some timing things on here. How do we view BI programs? And this is Lancet's 5 disciplines methodology. And for some of you, you may have seen this before, but this is how we execute against all of our BI programs that we help our clients with. And there are 5 disciplines, and as we talk through executive support today, we're going to be dealing primarily with that business integration discipline. And if you have any interest in learning more about that, you can just let us know. But for today's discussion, we'll be on the very top part of this discipline on the business integration. So before we begin, what I really want to talk about is the idea that BI, business intelligence, is an ecosystem. So if you remember in your 4th grade biology class, your teacher probably showed you something that looks very similar to this. And we adopted it for our own evil purposes here at Lancet. And when we talk about BI and how each of these things are interrelated, we think about it like an ecosystem. And the idea really here is that you can't have a successful BI deployment if any of one of these things is sort of out of whack or out of balance. And for our purposes today, the one we're really going to focus on is the executive. So you may recall from your 4th grade biology class that the executives in our context are the fire. And while you may feel like sometimes your executives are a big fire or create big fires, the fact of the matter is fire from an ecosystem perspective is really beneficial. And that's true for your executives as well. So you don't have a fire every day in your ecosystem. If you did, it would again be out of balance and it would not do well. But when you do have a fire, it can be very restoring to your environment. And that's the function that executives serve in your ecosystem. You don't really want your executives in there every day, but when you want them in there, they're going to be really critical to the success. So the most important person on your team is your sponsor. And let me sort of say this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, right? Your sponsor is incredibly important to the success of your project, but you can't really have a BI program without ETL and report development. So everybody's very important, but at the end of the day, having a highly engaged sponsor is critical. And you have to educate them to be your advocate in the boardroom and keep them in the loop, and don't rely on someone else to do it. So if your BI program is expensive, which many of them are, then the topic will come up a lot, and it will come up in the boardroom when the doors are shut and you don't have the opportunity to be in there to defend it. And if you don't have a really strong sponsor that can sort of stand toe-to-toe with other folks in that boardroom to defend your program, you could really lose out pretty quickly. And we're going to go through a couple of case studies today that will talk about situations on each of those, on the continuum of sponsorship, shall we say. The important thing really is around educating so that you do have a highly engaged sponsor. You have to keep them in the loop and don't rely on someone else to do it for you unless you really, really trust that person. But the most important thing is that they understand all the implications of certain aspects of your data warehousing and BI environment. They're never going to be an expert like you, but they should know enough to be able to challenge the other folks in that room.
Or there's a question that came in. How do I make sure that my sponsor is educated enough?
Good question, because that is a little bit of a, there's a balancing act there, right? Because again, you're not going to make that sponsor an expert, but what you want to do is make sure that the expert or the sponsor knows sort of the primary headings, if you will, around business intelligence. So the idea is they have to know and understand that data modeling and architecture is important, and you give them the top 5 reasons it's important. That would be one way. Make sure that you cover some of the aspects of report development and what is needed in that space, and what are the complicating factors associated with report development. When you start talking about ETL, a lot of these topics, their eyes will start to glaze over. So you really want to sort of talk in bullet points to them about why it's really important that they should care about ETL, why it's really important that they should care about report development, why it's really important that they should care about data modeling, why it's really important that they should care about governance, and why it's really important that they should care about metadata. So those are sort of my top 5. You may have your own top 5, sort of depending on where you're at in your organization, but the things that you feel like are really important and probably the most expensive in your program, they should know about and understand, at least at a high level. Okay, so our first case study, and the names, I won't talk about names to protect the innocent or the guilty or the accused, or however you want to put that. But this one was a really interesting situation that I was asked to participate in. This company called me up, and they had been struggling for quite a while. And functionally what had happened was, a long time ago, some very smart people had created this data warehouse at this university. And they had done a really, really great job. They had very high user adoption. Everybody really liked the applications they were using, and the data made sense, and all of the great things that can happen in data warehousing sort of coalesced, and the stars aligned, and everything was working great. But one of the things that those folks didn't do is they didn't seek out a formal sponsor for their program, because everything was going great. So I think in some respects they didn't feel like they needed to. But at some point or another, without that formal sponsor, the executives or the leadership at this university had made a decision to purchase a new ERP software, and that ERP software came with a canned data warehouse. And the BI team and data warehousing team were really upset by this decision, and they tried to intervene and say, you know what, this is really going to mess things up. But without the context and without sort of having that educated, highly engaged sponsor, the executives just really didn't understand the implications of that decision, and they went ahead. And everything that was bad that could have happened did. This really great, very smart team sort of ended up leaving the organization. Somebody was put in charge of this that didn't have a lot of BI data warehousing experience, but was really smart and capable. Overall, the program lost a lot of credibility because the canned data warehouse, oddly enough, didn't meet their needs and wasn't nearly as good as what they had built from a custom perspective. And things just sort of quickly spiraled out of control. And about 2.5 to 3 years later, I get a call saying, can you come in here and help us sort of breathe new life into this? We're really struggling. And a lot of the struggle was just with credibility. And the person that was in charge of it today sort of asked me the question, why just seems too impossibly difficult to achieve this. Is it even really worth it? And it's a very good question. But I think for them, one of the major issues that they had and still have today is that they haven't sought out formal sponsorship for their program. And it really has impacted their ability to gain a lot of trust from an end user perspective, maintain that credibility, and build out something that is going to work for them. So what do we learn from this case study? And what we've learned primarily is that formality really counts when we're talking about sponsorship. It's not like this, hey, would you do this for me? Sure, why not? And then never talk about it again. You really need to create an agreement between you and the sponsor that they're going to go to bat for you. And in turn, you're going to make sure that that sponsor has all the information, the good, the bad, and the ugly, to make sure that they can appropriately defend the program to their peers. A lot can happen if someone at an executive level isn't at least be able to defend the basics of your program. Okay. So the question is, how do you find that sponsor? So there was about half of you that don't have a sponsor, and maybe you're kind of struggling with that. Excuse me. There's three role types that you can really have a conversation with about sponsorship. And these are very different approaches to getting this work done. But we're really talking about traditional roles like, the CIO, what I call the influencer, and the traditional sort of grassroots effort. So let's talk through each one of those a little bit. The doorway to sponsorship is really to have someone in a position of authority become your sponsor. And the easiest way to do that is to just have a conversation with one of those folks and formally ask them to be your sponsor and give them all the great reasons why they should go ahead and sponsor this program. Obviously, the advantage to talking to this person is you may get things started really quickly. One of the disadvantages is that they're often harder to gain access to. As a matter of fact, you may not even have any direct relationship with them, and this would feel really out of context, or maybe you haven't done it because it makes you sort of feel uncomfortable. So you may not know them well enough, but you may know somebody that does know them, and you could ask for an introduction. So that's one way to gain sponsorship. The other way that a lot of folks feel comfortable with is what I term the influencer. So this person may not have the right title in the organization, but they're really well respected, and they usually have the ear of somebody at that higher level that does have the right sort of quote-unquote title. So the advantage is that every company has them. You just sort of have to know who they are. The advantage is that you probably have reasonable access to this person. They're probably on their way up the proverbial corporate ladder. Maybe they're an assistant vice president or a director or something like that, but it's probably easier to gain access to them. And you may know them well enough to frame the conversation because they are hanging out in the cafeteria, or maybe you have working management and they're in meetings with you. Obviously, it will take longer than going directly to a sponsor. And the interesting thing about talking to an influencer, which I think we'll get into in a little bit more detail, is when you're talking to an influencer, you really have to sell them on why they're going to stick their necks out for you versus with a sponsor. You're sort of doing the same thing except in a slightly different context, and you only have to sell to one person. If you use the influencer, you really have to sell the idea of BI and BI sponsorship to the influencer, and then once you get to the traditional role, you have to sell it to that person as well. So that's sort of why it takes longer from an influencer perspective. And then finally is the grassroots effort, and I think we're probably all really familiar with this method. We've all used it in the past in some some way or the other, and this is probably because all of us are much more comfortable with our peers. But the idea here is that you really talk to anyone that you can about this program and what interests you about it and why you think it's really valuable. The advantage is that you spread the word where most of the people are, and what happens is it sort of takes on a life of its own. You know you're successful when somebody you've really never met with or never interacted with before comes to you in the hallway a couple of months later and says, hey, I heard about that BI program thing you're doing. That's a really great idea. I'd like to learn more. That's how you know you're successful when you're doing a grassroots effort. It definitely takes the most time, which is a disadvantage, and it can take a very long time. One company that I worked with, it took us almost a year to get enough grassroots effort, interest, to sort of get that snowball up to the top of the hill. But once you get it up there, you can sort of let it roll. It really does take on a life of its own. Sometimes you won't be successful, and you'll still have to talk to someone in a traditional role or an influencer. Maybe it's just going to take too long, and you just have to figure out a way to get around it. But this is really a good mechanism for trying to get some interest. And I think we have a poll question here along the lines of these three concepts. You just take a few seconds to answer that poll question for me. Excellent. Well, very few shy people on the phone. That's good, and I do agree with many of you. The traditional way is really the way to go. One of the challenges with doing it that way is how you position the message, and we'll go ahead and talk a little bit about that next. So talking with the CXO, and how do you do that? How do you position some of those conversations, particularly if you are sort of an unknown, or maybe you're a known but in a different context, like you're known from a straight-up IT perspective. And what we want to do is focus more on the BI side of the world and talk about the business value associated with data warehousing. So what do you really say to this person? And you can sort of start off with talking about, I want to talk to you about the benefit of business intelligence, and it will help us be more competitive, meet regulatory requirements. What you really want to do as much as possible is do a little reconnaissance on the person that you're meeting with, talk to people that have worked with them in the past. If you have a relationship with somebody that works directly with them, even if it's their administrative assistant, let's face it, those folks run your companies. Talk to them about how they like to hear things and the things that they like to do and like to, how they like to be presented to, and sort of do some of that recon, because that will help you when you start talking about presenting to them. It'll talk. You'll be focusing on the audience, right? So you always want to focus on your audience and how you present to them. We want to find out if they have any hot topics, so to speak. So obviously your CFO probably cares about budget, right? But maybe they really have a hot topic or really focused on some certain regulatory compliance thing like SOX. Or maybe something just happened recently where they got burned pretty bad and it's sort of top of mind for them. Those are the kinds of things that you really want to be thinking about. You can certainly use any of these things that is on the slide, talking about being more competitive or more efficient, improving customer satisfaction, but those are really sort of generic statements that any company can use. You really want to focus it not only on your company, but in your industry, talking about competitive differentiation, or any hot topics that are really, really specific to that person. You always want to be prepared, because you just never know when you're going to get this opportunity to meet with this person. So maybe you're quite literally stuck in the elevator with them, going down at the end of a Friday, and you have a minute to talk to them about meeting with them formally. I do sort of want to make sure that folks aren't approaching people in the bathroom. It does happen, and I want you to know that I don't support that approach, but I do want you to always be prepared. So you really should try to write a elevator pitch, and it's a pretty brief, sort of 30-second thing that you can say that will help get the message across that you are interested in talking to them about sponsorship because you feel like it's going to provide a lot of value to your organization. And remember thinking about them. What is the business value that you think will really sort of hit the mark with them in that 30 seconds that will make them agree to meet with you to learn more? So I really believe that you should write down an elevator speech and practice it, believe it or not, because you just never know. Maybe it's a retirement party in the cafeteria and you got 30 seconds to pull them aside. It's those situations or those opportunities that will really differentiate your opportunity to identify a sponsor. And when you start talking to influencers, you want to position it just a little bit different. And with sponsors, you're not formally asking, or I'm sorry, with influencers, you're not formally asking them for sponsorship. You're formally asking them to help you gain sponsorship. So what you want to do is ask them to help you with something. And then you have to tell them what BI is all about. So you have to sort of spring into the same sales talk that you have to spring into with a traditional role. But with the influencer, you really have to appeal to their two things, to their want to help you and to their interest in climbing the ladder. So that sounds sort of negative, but the fact of the matter is if they're an influencer, odds are they want to be higher up in the organization. And you can position it like, you know what, if we can figure out how to do this, our competitors do this way better than we do. But if we can sort of leapfrog our competitors by doing X, Y, and Z, we'll be in such a great position. And that usually helps at least perk up that person's interest enough to want to talk to you a little bit more about what that really means. So those are kind of the things that you can do when you have never gained sponsorship. But what happens when you've lost it? So this is really interesting. And when I was putting this presentation together, I knew that I wanted to cover sort of these three: never had it, lost it, and have had it from the beginning. And the two on the either end, the never had it and the had it committed from the beginning, really came to me immediately. I knew which companies I wanted to talk about. They're sort of the hallmarks for both of those situations. For the lost it, I can tell you honestly that I have talked to so many companies that are in this exact situation that I sort of combined a bunch of them together because it happens a lot. So the idea here, and this was actually a direct quote from somebody I talked to about this, and essentially he said to me, you know what, we were totally heads down. We were trying to deliver as quickly as we could, and he looked up and his sponsor had left. So he'd done a lot of work around gaining that sponsorship. That person got another opportunity, left the organization. He didn't have a chance to follow up with him. He didn't really think too much about it because, you know, he felt like there were other people that really understood what they were trying to do. But 4 months later, after the new budget cycle, they found themselves in a very different place. Their budget was cut by half. They had to do some creative staffing and move some people around. And it was really a wake-up call for this group. So what happens in this situation? And it does happen so much. And what I really recommend is if you find yourself at this intersection of had it and lost it, do an assessment of the landscape. And when I say that, maybe you say to yourself, geez, I am not that great at that. You know, you got to kind of bat me upside the head for me to realize that something went down in the organization. Then reach out to somebody that you know that might be pretty good at that and see if they can help you take a step back and see what the next best step is. But what you really need to do is look at the landscape of the organization. Try to be really objective about what your program has delivered, maybe what it hasn't delivered, the perception of the program throughout the organization, because all those things will be really important if you have to go and find a net new sponsor, somebody that doesn't know you at all. If it's possible, talk to the person before they leave. You may not know they're going to leave. They may not know they're going to leave, so this may not be possible. But if it is possible, sit down and ask them for advice. You know, they know a lot about your program. They know a lot about you. They also know about their peers. So maybe they can say, yeah, you know what, Joe is ready to go. I've talked to him about it already, or we've talked a lot about it, and Joe's really the guy for you. And it may be as easy as that. One of the things that you need to do when you start thinking about a sponsor, whether it's you never had it and you're trying to gain it, or you lost it, is determining who has the most to lose without it. And that person may not be the obvious one. It may be somebody that you really hadn't thought of. So again, that's part of assessing the landscape, just asking questions and asking around and seeing who that person is. And really, probably the most important point I want you to get out of this particular case study is don't hesitate. Very soon you're going to need somebody that can back you up. The senior leadership meets a lot. They're always talking about budget. You really don't want to let it go for a month or two without creating a really strong sponsor to replace the one that you lost. So if you follow best practices, you will likely have a support structure that supports your governance function. So you have a data governance function, or you maybe even have just an IT portfolio or IT governance function. And you may be able to just go to that group and rely on that group to provide you sort of gap fill sponsorship. It's not ideal to have a group, quote unquote, a group sponsor the program. You need a buck stops here person. But the important thing there is you have a really great, strong internal network, because your governance committees should know an awful lot about your BI program. They should be well educated, and your new sponsor may be in that group now. So rely on that group to sort of get you through if you have that group. If you don't, obviously, then, well, that's another webinar, actually. So here's a corollary. Please don't rest on your laurels, because you just never know what will happen. You can lose a sponsor at any time. So you want to make sure that you are always selling your BI program. You're always marketing it. You're always talking about the great things that your team is doing. That is one of many, but an important part of your job. You have to market your program, even if right now you have the best sponsor in the world, because you just never know what will happen. And you don't want a sponsor that's going to abandon you the first time that something goes south either. So that's another reason why you want to make sure that you're always thinking about it from, what do I do if I lose the sponsorship that I do have?
Laura, here's another question that came in. This feels really cynical.
I think that's cyclical.
Okay, like you've never, sorry, like you're never really done gaining sponsorship. Is that true? Sorry about that.
I am cynical, for those of you that know me. And I try to check it at the door when I do my webinars. But no, the question is, it feels really cyclical. Like you're never really done gaining sponsorship. Is that true? And yes, 100%, that is true. Even if you have a sponsor, you need to be marketing to that sponsor, because you need to always be sort of reintroducing the concepts and reinforcing the value to that person. They're super busy, and even if they're a great sponsor, you're not going to be number one on their brain all the time. So you have to be reminding them. Executives have incredibly short attention spans. They have to. That's part of their job. So you need to really be in a position where you can be reminding them frequently of what a great job you and your team are doing. And not just your sponsor today, but somebody that might be your sponsor in the future. And our final case study talks about those lucky programs that have committed sponsorship from the beginning. And I'm going to talk about a healthcare organization that I worked with in the past. And really, when we started talking about sponsorship for this program, we sold it under the guise of risk mitigation. And the particular senior vice president that we talked to at the time had a very big challenge in front of them, in that the current reporting and analysis structure that they had produced different answers to the same question all the time. And so he was really worried that it wasn't just inconsistency that we were providing out to our clients, not just internal but external clients, but that it was just flat out wrong. And so we used that. When I told you earlier that you have to look at the hot topics, we used that hot topic for this for the senior VP to say, hey, you know what, we can help you with this. And at the end of the day, risk mitigation was pretty easy to achieve for us in that context. It was a lot about audit controls and archiving data and all of that kind of stuff. And he ended up being a really great sponsor because through that process, we brought him with us. And he ended up being an incredibly educated proponent for the BI program because he recognized it as a strategic differentiator. Now that program has suffered a lot over the past few years, and they really have struggled through the traditional things that every BI program struggles through. Maybe haven't delivered enough value for the cost, or struggled with governance and user adoption. So there's nothing special about what that program is doing from a delivery perspective, but what's really special about that program is that sponsor still stands up every budget cycle and backs up that program. So that's what BI sponsorship is really all about, and that's really why you need it. So what happens if you're in that situation? You know, geez, congratulations, first of all, you get the blue ribbon, but of course, a word of caution, because I'm cynical, you can end up in the lost category pretty fast. You know, just flat out, the person could leave the organization, and then there you go, there you are. So again, you have to make sure that you're always doing that. So maybe you make sure that you have more than one executive sponsor. Maybe you have an entire team of them. Now, I know for a fact that this organization I'm talking about does not have an entire team of executive sponsors, and even a couple that maybe aren't so big on it. So that particular program is at risk. But if you fall into the category of have it, and you have a sponsor and they're really strong, and maybe you feel like they're not going to leave the organization, I still wouldn't completely count on that. And maybe the best position that you can be in is to not just create one executive sponsor, which is the formal one that really is saying that the buck stops to your person, but you really do create all of your senior leaders as sort of a functional sponsor or stand-in sponsors where they all agree that it's absolutely the right thing to do and nobody questions it, so that if that sponsor does leave the organization or retire or leaves under no choice of their own, you have a line of people waiting to step in. And again, you know, spend time educating them and informing them of the progress. That's if you've heard anything from me today, you've probably heard that a number of times. Okay. So I think we have one more poll question for you. And I'm just kind of curious because you're sort of split 50-50. Some of you have sponsors, some of you don't. So I'm kind of curious, for those of you that don't have it, did you never have it? Did you have it and lose it? For those of you that do have it, have you ever been in a lost it situation? So if you could just take a minute to answer that question for me, that would be great. Looks like the vast majority of you have had it and have had it committed from the beginning. So that's interesting. It's interesting. But a couple of you have had it and lost it and never had it. So for those of you that have had it and have been committed from the beginning, I hope that some of the talk today has really helped you understand that it's really important that you never take that sponsor for granted. We did get a question while that poll was being answered. I feel like I've tried everything and nothing has worked. Any hints on how to get a really stubborn executive on the bus? Well, short of resorting to bribery and violence, that's a joke. You know, that is really hard because thinking about it from an executive's perspective, what in the world do I have to gain from sticking my neck out for a BI program that probably is going to cost a lot of money? And there are some executives that will never be that person, that will never stick their neck out. They're just risk averse. You'll find a fair amount of CIOs to be relatively risk averse. And by the way, CIOs are not your best sponsor, frankly. You know, the higher up in the business organization you get, the better off you are. So what I would say to you is maybe consider a different executive. Maybe it's somebody that's a little bit more risk averse and understands that sometimes you have to stick your neck out in order to really leapfrog in certain areas. The other thing is I would ask you to consider your message. So what are you saying to this person that isn't resonating with them? And think about it from their perspective. They're probably pretty busy. Not that we're not all busy, but executives deal with a lot of breadth, right? They don't have a lot of depth in their day. They have a million different little issues that take them into 16,000 different directions every day. So what is it that, when you think about it from that perspective, what is it that's not resonating with them? Executives always like to talk about ROI, and BI professionals never like to talk about ROI. So maybe you need to have sort of a talk with yourself and your BI team about, well, how do we get to ROI? Maybe we can show some kind of quantifiable value out of this program. And I guarantee you, if you do that, one of your executives are going to sit up and listen. So those would be some of my hints on how to get stubborn executives on the bus. And good luck to you. So in conclusion, I didn't like to write in conclusion on my slide, so I put that's a wrap, and I'm putting a little bow on our talk today. I want you to remember that sponsorship is a critical part of your long-term success. A couple of months ago, I read a tweet. I Twitter, so I read a tweet that said that sponsors are nothing more than somebody for your vendors to sell to, and I just categorically disagree with that assessment. Number one, you need a sponsor to make sure that you have funding, and number two, don't let your vendors talk directly to your sponsors without you in the room, and that's coming from a vendor. So I don't need to sell to your sponsor any more than I need to sell to you. So those conversations should be happening with you in the room. There is more than one way to find a sponsor, so don't get too depressed. And maybe the easiest thing for you to do, that person that just asked that question, is to really start a grassroots effort, because eventually having everybody in the organization support it is going to push executives to the other side. So just remember that there's always more than one way to skin a cat, and don't get too disillusioned by it. Sponsors have to be engaged and ready to go to bat. If you find a sponsor and you don't feel like they're going to be a really strong advocate for you, go out and find another sponsor, because they're not the right one. And value is what brings and keeps your sponsors to the program, period. So if you can't find a sponsor, then maybe a great thing to do is go out and try to find either talk about or market the fact that you've been providing value and you just haven't been tooting your own horn, or find a way to create a lot of value on the business side, and then talk about sponsorship after that. I thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you learned something today from our time together. You can reach me anytime at my email here or my phone. If you found this content interesting, there's a couple of ways to read more of my stuff. I Twitter. Sometimes I say things like spending an hour cutting, dicing, and roasting squash doesn't seem worth it. So you have to listen to that stuff to get above that and hear about my little talks about BI. I also blog. If you want a tweet sort of on steroids, you can read my blog. I also am doing a little bit of an experiment where I have an online BI community. It's like a support group for BI professionals. I put all of my presentations out there, and you can ask me questions any old time, and I'm happy to answer them. And there's about 19 or 20 folks on there right now, and they come from every industry that you can imagine. And really the idea is that we support each other in our BI journey. It is a sales-free zone. We don't sell to you. It's just really where we can all talk about this work and how do we make it more effective. If you're interested in that, just drop me an email. And I am a little late on providing new content, but I am the co-host of the Healthcare Channel on the BI Network, and you can check that out at binetwork.com. Thank you again for your attendance, and feel free to drop me a note if you have any other questions.